I really want to talk about the relevance of Kentland to the community, and I mean to everyone, because too often when we discuss the history of places, you know, and I think to some extent this is what Frederick Jackson Turner was alluding to when he posited the frontier hypothesis, you know, that American history prior to the 1870s was really just the history of elites. And I understand that Kentland has so many layers of history, even today, that this is an important place in the whole community, and especially people who've lived in the Toms Creek Basin and Brush Mountain area. Virtually everybody that's been here for 5 generations or more has some really profound tie to this place. And, you know, I'm an advocate of place and rootedness as really a fundamental human right. It's something that gives us identity, and hard to convey that in a world that is increasingly transient. Excuse me. But if you go down the road here to Long Shop, to Terry Albert's service station, or go up to the rescue squad, or go down McCoy Road and drop in on Gale Williams or Oak Shepherd, they'll all have a story to tell you about this place and about what it means to them, and something really special. That might be one of the forces that has motivated me more than anything to try to make this farm accessible to people. Is just the stories and the way people allude to their memories growing up here. Mr. E.O. Shepherd, who couldn't be with us tonight, he fell ill. He's in his late 70s, grew up here was born here. And, you know, when we first started coming out here and trying to assess the possibility of developing some sort of historic interpretive program, or even just a modest conference center or whatever here with a local historical theme, and asking people in the community out, you know, we drew on Reverend Price, and who in my mind is you know, one of the most brilliant historians of this area ever. And, you know, he connected us with other people that really needed to be in this picture. Particularly folks from Wake Forest. And I grew up around here. I knew a lot of these folks, but, you know, Reverend Price is the diplomat extraordinaire. And we started pulling in people that knew more about this land, this landscape, than anyone. And you know, early on, we had a first meeting with people in the community, and Mr. Shepherd just looked at me and said, you know, I come into the world here. This is a part of me. I can't let it go. The most sincere look in the world, and those voices motivate me. But let me just tell you about the layers of history. I mentioned it on the tour. We certainly know that in the mid-1980s, some people from the Virginia Department of Historic Resources were really concerned with the fate of this farm when Virginia Tech acquired it, not simply because Virginia Tech acquired it as a research facility. They didn't acquire it because of its historical significance. They acquired it because it was incredible farmland, needless to say. But the Department of Historic Resources was concerned about the historical uniquity of the space, and immediately coordinated surveys and the process of compiling petitions to get it on the state historical and the national historical registries, and thus we have a 300-acre historical district. What the archaeologists found was that certainly there's been human occupation back at least 10,000 years in the late Archaic period. You know, after the melt of after the Ice Age, as the glaciers were melting, and you know, the new river was up to the bluffs up there, and that's where we found late Archaic projectile points and certain forms of poverty. We haven't done extensive archaeological work on the indigenous record, although I think it would be quite fascinating, because where we are now, roughly on this plain, and to some extent the lower plains, they're saturated with American Indian artifacts. And I think most certainly that the occupants of this site in the late woodland period were predominantly Siouan-speaking peoples, possibly to some extent ancestors of the contemporary Monacans who are predominantly in Amherst County now, part of this vast alliance of Siouan-speaking tribes, which some of you may know as the Tudelo or Totero, the Saponi, farther south the Occaneechi, and farther north the Manahoac, in central Virginia the Monacans. And certainly by some of the explorers' records, I think it's safe to say that if they weren't here at the time the first European explorers came, then at some point they were prior to that, because we know that these people had ties going all the way into the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia, where the records tell us in 1672 that Needham and Arthur, the Needham and Arthur expedition encountered the Monoton people, a term you've probably heard, in which they claimed the name meant big water for the Kanawha River. Well, and I did some triangulation of that with Siouan vocabularies, and indeed it does fit with the little existing Tudelo-Saponi vocabulary that we have. But certainly I think we'll find, as in the case of Bissett Park and Radford, that there was on either side of the river at some points rather large towns. It could be that this was the Totoro town or Tudelo town that hosted and guided the Bats and Phelim expedition of 1671 farther west up the New River, and there they ended up around Rich Creek and encountered the old fields of the Monotons. That's debatable, but we certainly know they came through here because it was the logical point of travel following the New River. And following, as I mentioned on the tour, the Great Indian Road, which came, if you have light going out, you may be able to notice the rut at the turn, the final turn you make before you hit the entrance, in which, you know, is the tangible evidence of this ancient road that was certainly originally cut by migration of animals, to some extent buffalo even, and then later incorporated into the trade routes of various indigenous groups of the area. I like to emphasize that, you know, the Siouan presence in this part of the country, since so few people seem to be aware of it, and, well, having worked with the Monacan nation for many years, I'm somewhat biased, but the archaeology of this region is very interesting because you do see also some Iroquoian presence, which indicates Cherokees or related people, and in some cases some amazing overlap. It'll be interesting to see what we really find was here, because in sites in Bland County we find village sites that were simultaneously occupied by people bearing, at least in material terms, both Siouan and Iroquoian attributes in their material culture, and that, you know, speaks to the remarkable fluidity of these societies. You know, able to work out cooperative agreements in some cases, rather than always being constant enemies. But those were the predecessors. The first recorded European settlers here were Germans, Moravians to be precise, the Harmons. Now that's on this particular site. You know, other Moravians preceded them to the area. But in 1745, you know, we have the record of Adam Harmon being on this site and his brother Jacob across the river on the arsenal grounds. Now, I think probably many of you are familiar with the legend of Jacob's Lantern. Maybe not all of you, but I know that many of you are local history buffs, know that back when, was it the Marriott, was it, that had the restaurant called Jacob's Lantern, based on the legend that Jacob Harmon, who lived across the river, would keep a lantern burning at night so that his brother could walk across the ford without having to worry, you know, and vice versa about stumbling. and that ford remained a very important travel route even to the early 20th century when there were some formidable cattle drives coming off of this very farm. Now the Harmons are interesting characters because they didn't stick around too long. Apparently they didn't have a solid title to the land, and in 1745 John Buchanan came through. As Jay mentioned, this place became known as Buchanan's Bottom because Buchanan came through surveying under an order from James Patton, who was a commissioner for Augusta County, which at that point in time this area basically was a part of. And they were seeking to build a road to the New River. They thought that was an essential route to the west, to start opening the west. And of course this is a time, as you know, that people started accruing charters for settlement of this area, most notably the famous Draper's Meadow settlement. The Harmons then started moving further west. I have a sort of mysterious vested interest there because I'm told by some of my cousins through the Lester side of my father's side that we're descended lineally from Matthias Harmon, a brother of Adam. I'm still working on that connection, and the problem I have is that there are so many female ancestors with single names because 9 out of 10 of us were bonded servants, got shafted into coming over at the wrong time. So that kind of messes up genealogy sometimes. But needless to say, the Harmons are prominent in local history because, as some of you know, Adam Harmon is the one who found Mary Draper Ingalls when she returned from her captivity among the Shawnees around Gunpowder Springs. I've often heard it said, the story of the crazed Dutch woman that was traveling with her was found somewhere closer to this premises. Of course, somebody can easily correct me on that story, but that's one of many legends that we hear. After that, of course, Jay gave you the story of really the ownership of the land. I do think it's really where Virginia Tech is concerned, that we should be proud of the fact that one of the framers of the Constitution actually owned the land at one point in time. But let's look at the period when the Kents came and acquired the ownership of the land, eventual ownership after the Cloyds. It's an amazing story because this was the largest plantation in Southwest Virginia. And as some of us were talking about earlier, where else do you find this much incredible bottomland? But it didn't stop there. If you look at the history of the Kent family, and prior to James Randall Kent's ascension onto this earth, it's an amazing story. There were 3 Kent brothers who came to this continent, and was it 1750, I believe it was, and came into New York via Amsterdam. I'm reminded, if any of you have ever read Louis L'Amour's Sackett series, I'm reminded of Barnabas Sackett when I think of Jacob Kent, who came, although somewhat younger than Barnabas Sackett. He came here when he was 10 years old and somehow ended up on the frontier, a 10-year-old kid separating from his brothers, as far as anyone knows, following traders to this direction. And in 1755, or 1756, excuse me, is when he popped up down around Fort Voss, in Shawsville, selling his wares to the fort, and stayed around. This industrious young man at the tender age of 16, making his way on the frontier, and evidently doing an incredible job of it, because thereafter he acquired land in Shawsville, in the vicinity of present-day Edge Hill. And if I'm not mistaken, there's some vestige of his store there still, isn't there? Or among the outbuildings. I don't know. I may be wrong about that, but he lived down there for the remainder of his life. And the next generation of Kents, it was lived in that area around Fotheringay. Am I pronouncing that correctly? James Randall Kent, I believe, was actually born in Wythe County because his father, Joseph Kent, swapped the land at Fotheringay for some land in Wythe County, I think in the vicinity, somewhere between Max Meadows and Fort Chiswell. And that is where they actually, prior to that, began their Cloyd Association. But that is where he met his wife, Mary. But it amazes me that the wealth, that Joseph Kent, being this real entrepreneur, was able to amass. I mean, this is the story of the American frontier. So when they started construction, one of the things, as I said outside, I think it's really important to emphasize the role that slaves played in the building of this plantation, and other people, the German settlers that lived here and continued to live in the area and played a role in the artisanship of this house and of all the structures. As I said earlier, most of this house was built of indigenous material. The timber was cut and sawed locally. Some of it hand-hewn. Definitely all of it milled on site. The stone quarried on Brush Mountain and hauled here by slaves for the foundations. The brick, the clay was mined down by the river, cast by hand and fired by the slaves, 4 spans thick. And you could do a book on Kentland brick, I think, because it made its way all over this area. Not just after T.K. Adams disassembled the kitchen and built houses across the creek, but prior to that, some brick probably from the old slave houses went to the Great Valley Mine to build the superintendent's office. And people around here, if you're not careful, you'll find walls made of Kentland brick. And it's enduring. But it's brick that was touched and formed by the hands of slaves, many of whom evaded the record, not by their own choice, and whose blood, sweat, and tears made it possible for this farm to thrive in many ways. I just want you to look at these walls and feel the brick and look for fingerprints, because their progeny are still here 3 miles down the road in Wake Forest, and they work very closely with us. And as I mentioned, we will be commemorating the slave cemetery in a couple of weeks on April 30th. But slavery is a key point. I mentioned earlier on the tour that we see the imprint not just in the sheer labor that went into the construction of this, and the artisanship, that most of these slaves were skilled artisans, working alongside German artisans who were just generations of stonemasons, some of them, whether they admit it or not, still among us. But they're here, and their imprint is here. Now, Kentland, which, as Jay mentioned, was not called Kentland, it was the River Farm or the River House in most of its day. And perhaps in those early days of James Randall Kent's proprietorship, just known as Buchanan's Bottom. But he quickly became, and not just through his fortune of marrying into the Cloyds, I think through the sheer entrepreneurship that was part of his family, the richest man in this county, to be sure. As far as I know, the richest man in Southwest Virginia, however you define Southwest Virginia. Also, unquestionably the largest slaveholder. On record, we find somewhere around, just shy of about 130 slaves on record, but through various compilations, and that was for this farm, it seems that by 1860 he had about 300 slaves. Understand that this was not his only plantation. He had a Pulaski plantation. He also owned lands in I believe, Wythe County and in what became Mercer and Monroe counties, West Virginia. So his slaves were moving around. Now, you know, it's one of the great myths that we continually try to debunk in talking about Appalachia is the notion that slavery was not prevalent in the region. When in fact, you know, it was thriving in various ways. People think, well, the mountains, you know, just not entertaining to large-scale agricultural endeavors that would require slaves. But understand that slave labor was used for more than just agriculture. Wilma Dunaway, who's a sociologist at Virginia Tech, not too long ago published a book about slavery in Appalachia. And one of the points she makes is that if nothing else, Appalachia produced a lot of slaves for markets elsewhere. Now, the extent to which that was true on Kentland, I couldn't say. I don't think that that was necessarily the case. What I do know is that Kentland slaves were used for public labor very extensively. For one thing, James Randall Kent, not only being a planter, but a major financier of some of the most ambitious endeavors in Montgomery County. He was a major financier of Montgomery White Sulphur Springs, which, you know, the legacy of which is now the community of Montgomery Springs. He was one of the key founders of what became Virginia Tech, which was then called the Preston. I'm sorry, it was the Preston. Olin Preston Institute, right. Olin and Preston Institute, a key founder there. And I should mention subsequently, Major Cowan was on the Board of Visitors for that entity once it became a land-grant institution. So, you know, Virginia Tech has that automatic tie right there. But he was also the founder and president of the Blacksburg Savings Institute and a major stockholder, one of the major shareholders in the Virginia-Tennessee Railroad, which didn't quite make it here in his day, but came certainly into Dublin and Pulaski County. So because of all these public endeavors, you know, a lot of his slaves were engaged in public labor. One thing that we know on record for sure is that in 1864 that he sent a detachment of slaves to the Petersburg-Richmond area to help build fort works, trench works and fortresses around that area for the final defense. So, you know, that's what his slaves are up to predominantly. Now, you know, I think a lot of people find it somewhat surprised to realize that although this was referred to as a plantation, the primary commodity coming out of here was beef. And of course, that's what got him in trouble during the Civil War. Now, you know, I'd like to dwell on that point for a moment, though, to talk about the economic life that this provided for the community, because this wasn't just a plantation, it was a place that neighbors of the Kents, you know, regardless of their socioeconomic standing, might come for services. Because one thing about Appalachian plantations, and certainly true of Smithfield and any of the other plantations around here, is that they were highly self-sufficient. I mean, they were engaged in commercial activity with the rest of the world, but you know, given the distance from larger markets, it was necessary to be somewhat more self-sufficient. So, you know, that you would have a grist mill on site, and in this case, a sawmill and a wagon shop. You would have one of the crops that was in, if you compare plantations to the east, disproportionately more flax grown in this area because of the need for textiles. And I think that's one of the things that makes our local history most incredible. What I want to do, you know, mention though, is that this history really, of this plantation being such an economic center, continued for many years. Now, I mentioned the Civil War. It would be unjust not to mention the effects of the Civil War, because it's amazing stories, and some of you have probably read them if you've read the book on Kentland by Patricia Givens Johnson, Kentland at Whitethorn, right? But and there are varying versions of this, and I would certainly probably defer to Jay in the long run, because most of this is family history, and incredible history it is. In 1864, the Confederates, James Randall Kent stayed around home. He was not a young man, When at the onslaught of the Civil War, he was about 68, but he had been a major in the local militia, so he was very instrumental in organizing local forces, many of which were incorporated into the Stonewall Brigade. But in 1864, it became readily apparent that the Union was encroaching to the area to take out the Virginia-Tennessee Railroad. And as was always the case, the Union tended to burn down courthouses in the process. Such are the spoils of war. The county clerk became concerned, and James Randall quickly volunteered his house to store some of the records. So in a matter of hours, they constructed boxes and carted them over in the middle of the night and loaded them up into the attic here. By some accounts, those records sat in that attic until the early 1970s. There's some people that remember them being there. Unfortunately, nobody knows what happened to them subsequently. It'd be really interesting. I'm always a firm believer in that proverbial treaty in the trunk, but it's interestingly, though, shortly thereafter, the first week of May 1864, the Kents heard this thunderous roar from that direction, and they knew that trouble was coming. It was the artillery fire from Cloyd's Mountain as the Union under George Crook was moving their way in. And shortly thereafter, a courier came over the mountain and warned them, and were told that James Randall gave that courier his last horse, Black Polly, or his last stallion, so he could get back, because his horse was spent. And sure enough, Crook's forces showed up. How long they were here, the counts vary, but most of the Kent stories say they were here for about 4 days, or at least Crook's men followed by Averill's men. The great story is that they came to the house, and the women, notably Elizabeth and Margaret, made busy burying all the as much as they possibly could out in the sinkholes on the farm, the family treasures, silverware and such. And that by the time the Union arrived, very little was left of that. Some of it they stuck in chimneys. Margaret, who must have been this really strong woman, found an old silver ladle that had been in the family for years and couldn't hide it in time, so she stuck it in the pocket of her inner petticoat and had to keep that appendage sticking in her side for 4 days because they couldn't readily have privacy or change clothes or anything. And she went out to the meat house. The Union forces had already commandeered, if not destroyed, most of their food. She went out there to get a meager ham, and a Union officer came up and tried to take it from her and said, "Well, you go ahead and try, but I'll be damned if you're going to take this last morsel that stands between us and starvation." And the story is that he backed off real quick. By the same token, James Randall stood in the doorway, and they said, "We want you to vacate the house. We're going to burn it." And he said, "Well, you can go ahead and burn it, but you're going to burn it with us in it, because this is our place. This is our home." And the house survived, but the war really spent him. He got in trouble because he was providing the Confederacy with beef, substantial beef. And that it was never the same after that, the wealth. But this was an economic center, and it really remained so afterwards. After the Civil War, many people in this community had tenant tracts. They've been here for generations. These yeoman farmers would take on a tenant tract to farm, to live a little bit more, to subsist. As Reverend Price often says, you know, the folks around here farm to live. Ultimately, they mined to prosper. Because shortly thereafter, coal mines opened up. And James Randall, you know, had some interest in these coal mines. Certainly some of his property and some of the Odie and Hogue property hosted coal mines. One interesting thing we found in the records lately is a lot of interaction between James Randall Kent and Isaiah Welch, who was one of the land speculators who opened up the Southwest Virginia coal fields. I'm not quite sure what that was about yet, but I'll connect the dots soon enough. But in that time, people around these communities found a place here and hold so many memories of it as tenant farmers. Many people were born here. One moment that I just have to mention, you know, a couple of years ago when we were trying to pinpoint the slave cemetery and had several people from Wake Forest and Reverend Price and you know, kind of recording the moment, but then stepped back and Reverend Price, whose family farmed here, leased a tract, and some folks from Wake Forest started reminiscing about hard work along the river on those hot summer days and started talking about a place called Monkey Shoals, which is really an esoteric place name that spoke of this common heritage of a hard life, but one that was of an uncertain political or economic future, but yet one that was rewarded because of the camaraderie of hard work, both in the mines and on the farms. Monkey Shoals alludes to what they called the heat monkeys shimmering off the railroad track on that hot day, those little waves you see of heat. And they all knew that term. And that speaks of just that rich tie to this land that people have. You know, as I said to you when I started, I'm a storyteller and I can go on, but I should probably back off so some of you can get to bed. But what I want to tell you about our project to revitalize the historic district, you know, it's a tall order. We're fortunate that we have this house that's in such good shape, but in bringing the community in, especially around here, and making it a people's place, you know, we're trying to ameliorate some tensions that emerged unwittingly when Virginia Tech bought the property because, you know, Tech bought it as a business venture. They didn't realize what it meant to people in the community, but when it became state land, it became inaccessible. You know, no longer could people freely hunt. Prior to that, regardless of who owned it, people regarded it as the commons. They could hunt. They could come out here. Sometimes they could farm. They could just get away. They could ride horses across, take a shortcut to visit neighbors, come and reminisce when they lived here or lived down the lane or whatever. And that just simply became impossible. So what we're trying to do, I mean, it's a multi-tiered plan, but we want to turn this into a place where the community can represent itself, but where people can, you know, a hands-on pedagogical space. We don't want to freeze necessarily images of the past. We would like, and we're going to renovate this house, hopefully sooner than later. Fortunately, it's structurally sound. But even as it is, it's a remarkable place to feel the life that is here, and to have people that, you know, the descendants of the Kents, or the descendants of the Shepherds, or the descendants of the Eves and Joneses of Wake Forest, the descendants of the Prices and Alberts down the road. This is their place and everybody else's. And, you know, we hope to develop, you know, at least some sort of seasonal historic interpretive program. And, you know, and we invite impetus from anyone, you know. You want to tour the place, give me a call. I'll gladly leave my office any day for that. You know, got an excuse. But, you know, that being said, let me encourage you to come out on April 30th to the event that we're bringing the community together. And with that, I open the floor to questions. And thank you for putting up with me for this long.